Well, I think we should get started. We've got a full packed house today. Welcome back from fall break. Hope everybody's had a chance to get a little bit of a refresher, I hope. Sometimes when I have those opportunities, I go to the extreme, and I went to a undisclosed fun place near Orlando, Florida last week with my family. I'll post a picture. The good news is the rock and roll roller coaster in Hollywood Studios is still featuring Aerosmith. So that has not changed. I thought it would. I thought there was a rumor that they were going to put in a boy band to take over for Aerosmith. You know, the backstage pass? Any of you have ever been there? It's kind of fun. But anyway, this is a roller coaster that you accelerate from 0 to 60 in probably less than 3 seconds, and then you go upside down in a big loop in the dark. So it's quite a thrill. But anyway, we had a good time. So let's see. Let's catch up with where we are. What are we in? Week 8. For everybody here and viewing at home, Week 7 folder is not going to have anything in it because that was fall break. So don't worry about that if you don't see anything in Week 7. There was nothing technically due in that week folder. The quiz on Exodus I'll have posted, if not tomorrow, probably on Wednesday of this week, so it'll just be a day delayed there, so be looking for that. I'll put it in week folder 8. So the current week 8 folder will have activity for the discussion question based on today's lecture as we wrap up Genesis and we move into Exodus. So that'll be there. The reading quiz on Exodus will be there, and the lecture links for wrapping up Genesis today and Exodus will be also posted there. Now, the good news is none of the information today will be on the midterm. So just know that. Don't be confused. You have a study guide. I posted that before fall break for the quiz and gave you, so the midterm, and gave you instructions on kind of maybe some tips on how to prepare. Know that the full PowerPoint slide set, if you haven't noticed yet, is available in the midterm link in the navigation pane of Blackboard. So all of those things are self-contained for you there. Hopefully that was helpful. Any questions on that? Questions on that? Yes, Bonnie?
So you're going to post the midterm on Thursday, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the week, yes, because of your situation, this is important. What is it? That's the 12th. There'll be a test window this coming Thursday. That'll be live for about, 3 days? What did I say? 12th through the 15th. So sometime in the morning on the 12th, open test, Blackboard, full book, open Bible, open note, open textbook, although the midterm will cover lecture material, not so much the reading in the textbook. I'll make that clear. All comes from, the midterm comes from and is testing what we've talked about in class only. Yeah. So don't worry about that and get confused. Question from home?
Sandy, one of the online students asks, what is the structure of the exam?
Yeah.
Multiple choice.
Right. The midterm will be hopefully very clearly written, and not to be confused and not to frustrate you. Multiple choice questions, not multiple answer, all multiple choice, and some true and false with a couple short essays. Short answer essays. Not short answer, but short essays. Not the long essays, but just maybe a, whatever. I think I gave a word count. I remember exactly. I don't want to give misinformation, but the word count will be there. Not that I'm looking for necessarily a limit. You write as long as your time allows. There'll be a generous 2 hours for the midterm. You have plenty of time to gather your thoughts and not be stressed out. So just one of the essays will be more practical, related to your ministries and how to apply some of the things that we've learned. And one of the essays might be a little more closely related to what we've covered in class, a little more technical. So that gives you an idea. I think that answers the question. Okay, good. Any other questions for what we've got coming up this week? So, all right. Well, I've asked Weston to collect some prayer requests and pray for us. We've not done this, but are there any prayer requests that we can lift up to the Lord tonight before we get started on our lecture? Anybody? Even from home? I've got one. There's a a group leaving from my church this week to go over and teach in Myanmar. So Myanmar, it's kind of near Thailand. They're going to start in Thailand and cross over to across the border over there and do some teaching with some of the teaching the pastors there, the book of Timothy and some other things. So pray for Kip. KIP is his name. He could really use some prayer right now. He lost his wife last year, and he's still going through some pretty intense grieving and struggling right now emotionally just with ongoing grieving. And now the Lord's given him this opportunity to go over and teach, and I'm just praying that while he is used mightily of the Lord to teach, but the Lord would work powerfully in his own heart. That's my prayer. Anybody else? All right. Anybody from home? No? All right. Go ahead and pray for us and pray for our time tonight, Weston. Thanks.
All righty. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, just thank you for this day and letting us come here to learn about the book of Exodus and what you did then, and that you were the same God then, and you're still the same God now. And so I want to pray specifically for Kip as he goes to Myanmar this week, and for safety as he goes, and also healing from everything that he has been going through. I can't imagine losing a loved one so near and dear to his heart. And so, Lord, please use him powerfully this week. Let your name be proclaimed. Let the pastors over there benefit from his teaching and what you will use him to do. And so we pray for him as he goes out. Lord, pray for all the prayer requests that maybe weren't spoken today, and just that they lift them up. I want to pray specifically for my little nephew Graham. He's got surgery coming up soon on his eyes, and he's only 4 months old. So Lord, just be with him. Be over our time today. In your name we ask it. Amen.
I'll keep praying. Lord, I just continue to pray for the class. I pray for all of the students as they're preparing for the midterm, that you'd bless them, multiply their time and their energy and their efforts, and give them a clarity of heart and head this week as they complete that midterm exam. I also am mindful of Bonnie, our sister, who will be leaving soon here and be redeployed with relief efforts in the Houston area. I pray for her team, that you would use them mightily, strategically place them and allow them to be a blessing to others throughout their week of service. And for others who are continuing to rebuild in Houston, even Florida, we pray that continue to pray for the churches and those who are offering the assistance and the help, that you just again multiply their time and their energy as they serve you and expand your kingdom. Lord, we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I was mindful of your leading within the week, right?
I'm leaving Saturday.
Yeah, Saturday. Okay. All right. Well, let's pick up where we left off in my goofy picture of my dog and my daughter, which is only to remind us of the theme of deception. We talked about deception in terms of what it looks like and what it looks like in the biblical text. So we were talking about Jacob and the deception that he was involved in, deceiving his father with a little help from mom, with the terms of with regards to the blessing and the birthright, and this starts something not only in the life of Jacob, but also the sibling rivalry theme. This is going to be important. We're going to see sibling rivalry, this idea of jealousy and the grudge that's lodged into this brotherly relationship. This is going to be a significant theme as we move into the Joseph narrative, because we're going to see this theme continue on with regards to the household of Jacob and his sons. So this is where it gets started. Now, what we have to find out is what happens to these two brothers. Let's pick up in the context where we left off in, let's see, the conflict. Starting in chapter 28. Well, let's pick up with the words of Esau in chapter 27, and look over in when Esau discovers what's happened here. Let's have let's see, Garnett, you're over here. Could you start reading here in Genesis chapter 27, beginning in verse 34?
when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, bless me also, O my father. But he said, your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing. And Esau said, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing. And he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? Then Isaac answered and said to Esau, Indeed I have made him your master, and all his brethren I have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I now do? What shall I do now for you, my son? And Esau said to his father, have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth. And
Oh, wait a minute. Did you skip verse 38? Well, you did read it, right?
Yes.
Let's just stop there, verse 38. So Esau's response, and you see the emotional response over here in verse 41. Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing which his father had blessed him. Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So that's what a grudge does. So we're going to see where this gets worked out eventually here. What happens is Jacob, with the help of dad, is sent away as a means of protection. So in chapter 28, Isaac calls Jacob and blesses him, charges him, and says, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, which is really interesting there. Instead, go to Padan Aram, to your uncle's house, Laban. In verse 3, and God El Shaddai may bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, so that you become a company of peoples. May he also give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your seed or your descendants with you, that you may possess the land and your sojournings. You see there how the promise of Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant promises, are woven in to this strategic move here from the Father. So the seed, remember the seed, the conflict over the seed now is, now the crisis is averted, and the crisis over the seed, at least for now or for a time, is, we've got this seed being carried on through Jacob. So where's this going to go? Jacob is going to respond in obedience. But before we get there, let's turn over to a significant reaffirmation here in Jacob's dream. This is a passage here in chapter 28, beginning in verse 10. Let's see. Michael over here, could you read for us, beginning in verse 10 down through verse 15? You got it? Chapter 28, verse 10 through 15? Yeah.
Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in the place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up in the earth. The top of it reached heaven, and behold, angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land which you lie, I will give you, and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.
Okay, that's good. What's interesting in this, and I should have posted a picture in my PowerPoint set for this, but they find in the archaeology, when they find things in the dirt over there, stones with kind of this basic shape. And it's interesting, outside of the cities and along some of the highways of the day, where people were were traveling with their livestock or walking by foot, there'd be these basically the Motel 6s of the day involved permanent places, and the stone was shaped in such a way that you could literally lay your head down, and it's a nice, comfortable, and non-destructive pillow for the ancient world. So they have these things, and I think that's what's being referred to here in the stone in verse 11. He put a stone under his head. It was shaped like that. But you see again a reaffirmation. The Lord's, behind this plan to protect the seed and to move this his agenda, the divine agenda, forward. We're waiting for some things to happen yet with regards to where the seed's going to go and how it's going to be multiplied, or at least in the direction of the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. So we're waiting on this, but there's still some conflict going on here with regards to this promise of seed. So then we get to the place. Jacob's going to respond in obedience. In chapter 29, he's going to go to the household of Laban, the uncle, the brother of Rachel, and now we see some very interesting. Now, you kind of, I don't know, you read the Old Testament. I don't know if any of you ever expect to see humor showing up in how a story is told or how a historical account is brought in. And every now and then it surprises you. In this account, in Genesis 29, Jacob is going to meet up with Rachel. Let's see. Let's pick up in chapter 29, verse 10. And Amanda, where are you? You're back there. Start reading in chapter 29, verse 10.
Now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was his father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father.
Okay, so it's going to be love at first sight, and this is the woman of my dreams. Jacob is excited, and so excited he's willing to, and we see in the details here in chapter, down there starting in verse 16. And we learn a little bit more about the household of Laban. Laban has two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Now, in the details, we've got Jacob here willing to pay the bride price. So he's going to stay and serve the household of Laban for a period of time. And we have details with regards to Leah. Her eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I'll serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years, but it seemed like him to but a few days. A little bit of humor there, but he even gets better because of his love for her. So what we see going on now, beginning in verse 21, it's kind of a little bit of a irony here. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we go back to verse 11, because I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, the kissing verse?
No, the guy kisses me and then immediately lifts his voice and weeps. There's something wrong with that. Do you not agree?
Yeah, well.
Or did they do it that way back then?
As you'll see pretty soon, there's a lot of things that kind of show up as a little bit odd and clunky and awkward in this particular passage. No, I don't think it's probably common for the immediate kissing. There might be, there's a little bit of some extra emphasis given to Jacob's excessiveness, perhaps, with regards to his emotions. And, they seem to him but a few days because of his love for her. It seems to be a little more emphasis than Moses is putting on Jacob's extreme emotional response to the fact that he's found this beautiful daughter of Laban, whose name means beautiful. Her name actually means fair or beautiful. So let's keep going here and see how Laban responds. After the 7 years in verse 21, immediately he's asking for her to be a wife so he can officially make it official. And there's the reference to, the consummation of marriage there in verse 21, that I may go into her. Laban gathered all the men of the place, made a feast, which was appropriate, and came about in the evening that he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him. Jacob went into her instead. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was, Leah. Now, the punchline there is here and in the next picture, whose name means cow. That's the punchline. So you put that together with the details given earlier with regards to the description of Leah in verse 17. Leah's eyes were weak, but Leah was beautiful in form. So there's an extreme contrast there between the two daughters. Rachel was beautiful in form, and a little bit Leah was not a good looker, and her name means cow. So he wakes up and, you make the cow noise. You can do anything you want there. It's kind of a humorous moment. But the theological punchline you see coming down here a little bit further. What is this you've done to me, says the deceiver. Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? There's the punchline, right? The deceiver now is the one who's deceived. So that's kind of the twist that sometimes we see in these very tightly written and woven historical accounts that we've got here, these stories that Moses is giving us. So Laban says it's not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. So complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service, which you shall serve with me for another 7 years. So this is the deception that happens here with regards to Laban. And Leah's name means cow, and there's some obvious humor there. Verse 35, the implication, though, is with regards to the relationship between Jacob and Leah, we see the implications in verse 35. So Leah is conceiving again, and she bore him a son. This time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah, whose name means praise Yahweh. And then she stopped bearing. So this has implications for as the family or the household of Jacob starts to fill out here, we've got the promise of the seed. And we know that the Judah line is the one that will eventually, get us through to King David and then eventually to the Messiah. So this was while it's somewhat humorous, this is a significant seed moment for the promised one that we go all the way back to Genesis 3:15. Remember the promised he who will come in and take on the devil and bruise the devil on the head, but he himself will be bruised on the heel? Remember that promise, the undefined he? Now we start to see color showing up with regards to the promise. One from the line of Judah is going to fill those shoes eventually. All right. And again, this is an interesting account because this is not going to be the first time that we see the unloved, which is Leah, the unloved or the unnoticed woman in the story, or the rejected woman in the story, enter into the storyline in a significant way and carry forward or assist in carrying forward the seed promise. So where this is going to go, we're going to see just around the corner in Genesis 38, Judah now will take the rejected Tamar and provide the seed, and will bear Perez, who will have a significant role. At the end of the account of Ruth, when we get there, we'll see that Perez will lead to the eventual Davidic king, King David. So this is all kind of a interesting. These are not unnecessary fluff. These are theological moments necessary for the line of the seed, which is going to be a significant theme as we move ahead. But even more significantly, we start to see another thing that happens to Jacob, the deceiver. God has an agenda for Jacob, and we start to see that. Let's turn over to chapter 32. and beginning in verse 24. Let's see, Kevin, are you here, Kevin?
32, what is it?
You're back here, okay. Starting in 32, beginning in verse 24.
Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. The man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob. He touched his hip in the socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of socket joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." He said to him, "What is your name?" He said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God, and you prevailed."
So there you see the significant name change, which we've seen before. Avram changes to Abraham, and this happens after those times when faith is revealed or transformation takes place in the heart and life of the individual. So name changes always signal these kinds of forks in the road. And this happens after a divine wrestling match. God is getting the attention of this patriarch Jacob, and his name is changed from one who deceives to one who strives with God. So this transformation is significant for Jacob, because what's just around the corner for Jacob in the narrative is another great faith moment, like what we've seen with Abraham. Remember Abraham in Genesis 22, where he's tested, and then he has the conflict over the seed, interestingly, with his son Isaac, and offering him up as an offering. And then the Lord intervenes, and we have Abraham's willing to go to the nth degree to demonstrate loyalty to the Lord. But the Lord sees that at Mount Moriah, the mountain of seeing, and authenticates that loyalty. And then Abraham does the same as well by demonstrating that loyalty to the Lord. So this is what we see going on in the early chapters of Genesis. And so then what we see here is Jacob's great faith moment. And in the details of chapter 33, let's have Lisa in the back. Could you start reading in verse 1 of chapter 33?
And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all.
Yeah, keep reading. Verse 3.
Sorry, my pages are sticking together. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah and her children drew near and bowed down. And last, Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it.
Okay, thanks. So what we have here is a very moving scene. 2 brothers. All that we know and all that Jacob would have known is having to leave his household, being sent away from his father to go to Laban's household, because all he knew is that Esau had a grudge and was threatening to kill him. Now, there's no way of knowing what's happened since then, right? So you have to kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps, but this is a tremendous step of faith and trust that I would argue that Jacob is demonstrating here. He's putting his household at risk, and he himself goes out and bows, which is in verse 3 you see is the posture of submission and humility. And then Esau runs to meet him, and they have an embrace moment, and they have a weeping moment, and something has happened, and we don't have it in the details of the text necessarily, but I think something has happened in the life of Esau to change him. God has gotten a hold of him, maybe through a divine wrestling match, just like with Jacob. And we saw that with Jacob as God's getting his attention. So this is a reconciliation moment. It's how brothers should respond to one another. This is, I'll just throw out a few terms. The idea of, I'll get rid of this thing. This is a term that we're going to take with us into the Joseph narrative. So it's an important term, but I'm just going to talk about brotherhood. And synonymously, the idea of loyalty. And we start to see these pictures theologically just popping out of the word, the text of the Pentateuch, because we have to remind ourselves what audience would have been interested in this kind of picture, to be reminded of this. A group that's preparing to go into the promised land, where brotherhood, thinking of in terms of military loyalty, even, there's going to be battles fought. Brothers who will eventually become the 12 tribes of the nation Israel are going to have to get along and work together and work through conflict in order to make it happen, to be successful, in order for the Lord to work through them. So that's what I think Moses is putting emphasis, theological emphasis, where it needs to be. Brothers getting along, brothers demonstrating loyalty to one another, and this is going to be important. This is going to be an important theme as we jump into the Joseph narrative, which is just around the corner. So eventually here we're almost to the end of Genesis. So let's keep going here and see if we can get there. So we're not ready to leave the household of Jacob. And what we have here is one more account of Jacob and his sons before we get into the Joseph narrative, which is also important for understanding where these sons of Jacob are. And here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to bracket out in this next chapter, in chapter 34, the two youngest sons, Joseph and Benjamin, the two sons of Rachel, because they're younger, a lot younger. We're talking about the older brothers, the 10. So I'm going to refer to the 10 and bracket out the 2, because I don't think they're implicated in what's about ready to happen in chapter 34. But let's look at chapter 34, and we ask the question, if the brotherhood is being demonstrated between Jacob and Esau, what we're going to ask ourselves next is, where are his sons at with regards to this vital lesson? That is, the sons of Jacob. So let's take a look at where these brothers are, these older brothers of Joseph, with regards to chapter 34. And we won't look at all of the details of chapter 34, but to kind of set it up, we've got this interaction with the Shechemites. So the sons of Jacob, one of the daughters, and we see her referred to there in verse 1, Dinah, the daughter of Leah. She visits, and she's out on a dignitary tour of sorts, whatever. She meets up with the prince Shechem, whose father is Hamor, and he violates her. So there's a rape that happens. Now, to try to smooth things over, we see Hamor, the dad, coming in and beginning in verse 8. Let's have, let's see here. Andrew up here. Could you start reading in verse 8? See what the father has to say about the Akko Taco situation that we have here. Awkwardness. The awkward situation. Akko Taco, I have to define that because not everybody. My kids say that. Akko Taco, does that even register a bell or any meaning? So it's just an awkward situation. So now you can go ahead. Go ahead.
But Hammer spoke with them, saying this.
I was with an international. The reason I'm doing this is because why am I doing this? Well, we went to. Yeah, you're on pause for a second. We went to Disney and we met up with my sister and brother-in-law, and they have a foreign exchange student from Thailand. So she's learned English pretty well, but what I found myself having to do a lot, and you international students, I'm sure, we English speakers use a lot of cliche. And that doesn't register with someone who's not grown up in the American context speaking English and hearing all these cliches. So I was always, as we were walking along the path of the magical Disneyland, we were always explaining cliches along the way, because my brother-in-law and sister would always use cliches, and she was always turning to me, and I was having to define, well, this is what that means. So Akko Taco is an example of one of those. Go ahead now. I won't interrupt you again.
It's your class. All
I
right.
promise I won't interrupt you again. So go ahead.
Hammer spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shisham,
Shechem.
what is it?
Shechem.
Shechem, longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us, give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. Thus you shall live with us, and the land shall be open before you. Live and trade in and acquire property in it." Shechem.
Okay, let's just pause there. So Shechem. Yeah, actually, it would probably be Shechem. You got to roll the het in Hebrew, I think. Oh, it's a cough. Then it's not. Don't forget, scratch that, what I just said. All right. So this idea of intermarrying, what's going on here? Is this anything wrong with this picture? Huh? It is another odd thing. Should they be entering into this kind of relationship with a group of, Shechemites? No. This is a. What's interesting here is that this fits well into the picture of the ancient idea of the covenant relationship. You've got, two, household or patriarchal leaders meeting up, and when they enter into a covenant relationship, you see the exchange, intermarry with us. So there'd be an exchange of daughters, oftentimes, that would be symbolic of, you might say, sealing the deal. So this exchange of, which is very common in the ancient world. So they're asking for a covenant relationship here. Israel should, the patriarchs have been introduced to the idea of starting with the Abrahamic covenant. They're in a covenant relationship with the one king, right? Yahweh is entered into a covenant relationship. This is the covenant relationship that's been handed down as a baton from patriarch to patriarch. So Jacob and sons should have known a little bit better. But let's see where we keep going here. Andrew, keep reading for us and find out how the sons of Jacob respond in verse 13.
Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "If I find favor in your sight, then I will give whatever you say to me. Ask me ever so much bridal payment and gift, and I will give according as you say to me. But give me the girl in marriage." But Jacob's son answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit.
You see the word deceit there? We're starting to see something build, a little momentum here. Deceit or deception was one word that we saw previously used to describe the father before he had his transformation experience. So keep going here.
See, because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we consent to you. If you will become like us, in that every male of you be circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take our daughters for ourselves, your daughters for ourselves, and we will live with you and become one people."
Oh wow, this is just wrong on all accounts, right? Let's just redefine ourselves as a people. Let's take the bull by the horns and start entering into covenant relationships with pagan people groups all around, and no, this is a problem. And but it even gets worse because we see that the Shechemites agree to the terms. For the Israelites, in circumcision was wrapped into the kind of a part of the sealing of the deal with regards to a covenant relationship. And we see what happens here in the aftermath in verse 25. It came about on the third day while the Shechemites, they were still in pain, that two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came upon the city unawares and killed every male. How are we doing? For deceit, for deception. And here we have, piled on top of that, we start to see, I would argue, the true colors of these brothers being deceitful together, and I think in agreement here, prone to deceive for personal gain or revenge, these are the brothers, these 10, and prone to kill even in order to gain the upper hand, or to gain the advantage. So it's important to know, before we get into the Joseph narrative, that we're not seeing this yet with these brothers 10, and this is going to be part of the problem that we're going to see in the early chapters of the Joseph narrative. So that's where we're going to go next. But before we do, just as a way of reminder, we've seen now I keep coming back to the conflict over the seed. It's important because in the genealogies that we see from the first image of God-bearing couple, Seth down to Noah, right? And we see the continuation, and that helped us to understand, perhaps if you agree with me, the conflict in Genesis 6. The sons of God taking daughters from the daughters of men, or from whoever they wanted. And this continues down through the line. This kind of detail won't be on your midterm or anything like that. Don't worry about it. But you have these charts available to you. Then we get to from Noah down to Terah, Abraham's father, and then we branch out into the patriarchs, and we see with Jacob, and then how Leah and Rachel, and then two handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, produced the rest of the 12 sons. The two younger by the wife Rachel, whom he loves, and the others whom he doesn't love, but still provides sons for the sons of Jacob. So Joseph and Benjamin are the two that will kind of bracket out because they're younger as we move into the story of Joseph, the Joseph story and the Joseph narrative. So that's where we'll go next. Made popular on Broadway with someone who some of you might not even know, but this famous, what would you call him? What mode of music would Donny Osmond fall into? Pop? Nobody knows? Nobody really cares? Huh? Would it be? Wouldn't be pop?
Terrible.
Terrible music, yeah. Terrible music. Donnie and Marie. I mean, I grew up watching the Donnie and Marie show. They had one, and it was, do you remember that? Donnie and Marie?
You don't confess that.
I don't want to confess that, so we'll have to edit that out, Adam. Thank you. But no, I'm just kidding. But here we move into the Joseph narrative in chapter 37. So let's go there. And we start to see some of these things fall into place. What I'm trying to do is help you grab on to some of these major themes that overlap throughout the entire, here we have the patriarchal narratives. They're a little hard to keep track of sometimes. There's so much going on. But some of these themes help us to see the continuity that kind of overlaps between patriarch to patriarch to patriarch. Where critical scholars oftentimes want to break them up and not really connect them at all. I've tried to see the connections. And like one attempt was the book that I wrote with regards to the theological theme of testing. That's a huge theme that pops out, and we'll see it here front and center in the Joseph narrative. So we'll spend a little time talking about that before we're done today. But you see in chapter 37, verse 1, Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, that is Abraham, in the land of Canaan. These are the records, or the Toledoth, the generations of Jacob. So now Joseph was 17 years of age. He's older now. He's pasturing his flock, his family household's flock, with his brothers while he was still youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. So there's a bad report. We have to fill in the blank as to what that might be, but we can only guess that this is a bad report because they're bad brothers. We've got problems with this group. And we see in verse 3 something to connect to the previous theme of the sibling rivalry that we saw between Jacob and Esau, but then resolved, but then carrying over, because we have Israel, or Jacob, loving Joseph more than all of his sons because of the mother Rachel, whom he loved more than Leah and all the others, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a multicolored tunic. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, so they hated him. They could not speak to him on friendly terms. All right, so this is the sibling rivalry theme that we see starting to set in to the Joseph narrative early on. And we see this sibling rivalry carry on down into verse 8. His brother said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us?" in response to the dream, right? You remember the dream account? Over us? Are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for all of his words. And then you go down to verse 11, and his brothers were jealous of him, that is Joseph, but his father kept saying in mind. But his father kept the saying in mind. You kind of wonder, and I think I asked this question in the speaker notes here, but what did Jacob know and understand at this moment or at this time in the narrative about the character of his 10 sons? If he's concerned as a patriarch, he's had the divine reaffirmation of the promises that have been made to the fathers before him. God's agenda has been planted in his heart and mind. He knows that there's going to be something that's got to be carried forward, future, but maybe he's Jacob. I'm wondering if he's looking at this group of 10, scratching his head as a father, saying, I don't know which one it's going to be. These guys are, I'm kind of disappointed and discouraged as a father. You know, it's not in the text necessarily, but it's just a question that I've asked myself. But we see so that's what we see. So the sibling rivalry, which leads to what we see in chapter 37, verse 18. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. Now, that's in consistency with what we saw with the Shechem account. A group of brothers, a group of 10, who get together and agree to plot against and even kill in order to advance their agenda. I'm going to take this guy out. This is fratricide. This is not brotherhood. This is the opposite or the antithesis of brotherhood. It's not loyalty. And this is what we have with these brothers. So this is important to know and recognize early on. We have some initial kind of well, I guess what I need to say here, we've got Reuben kind of stepping in, right, in the account. But it's a little ambiguous, really, what's going on there. He seems to have kind of a side plot with regards to rescuing Joseph from this situation, maybe after the lights are turned off at night or whatever. So that's what we have here, but it's somewhat ambiguous, which is what we'll see for the rest of the Joseph narrative. There's some ambiguity sometimes. We're not really sure really where the heart is of these brothers. I mean, all the way to the end, as we'll see. So let's just keep looking at this part here. So they took him and threw him in a pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. So and then they sat down to eat, and behold, some traders come through, right? You know the story, these traders, what they do and what they end up doing is selling for profit their brother to be a slave, to be a servant for these, wherever he's going to go. Here's my point with this. This is fratricide. When you desert and abandon a brother, it's as good as writing him off. I would make that argument. So while they didn't immediately commit fratricide, they really did at the end of the day by committing anti-brotherhood or disloyalty, turning their backs on a brother, forgetting about him, and then you see the remaining details take place with regards to how they're going to plot and cover up the death of their brother and deceive their father Jacob with regards to throwing blood on the multicolored coat and taking that back and showing Dad, this is what's happened to Joseph. So that would be my interpretation of the Joseph account so far. So right now they're not doing so well with regards to brotherhood. They're acting in consistency with what they've already demonstrated with the Shechemite passage earlier that we saw. So this is going to be a problem. Now what we'll find is, pretty quickly here, the Lord is not removed from the situation. The Lord has an agenda for this family, this household. And right now, and it's interesting that we'll see that despite the setbacks or the lack of faith of the individual, or in this case a small group, God has a way of working through and getting to his point B despite the infidelity or the lack of faith or the lack of follow through. We have already saw the faith course of Abraham. We're kind of seeing something like this for the household of Jacob, only it's kind of going downward really quick. So what we see, though, and if we have to we need to remind ourselves that theologically, remind ourselves of who the author is and who the audience is. So what's important for Moses, the author, is that Israel, poised and being prepared for the promised land, see themselves in the page if necessary. We can't act like this. This is the opposite example of the kind of brotherhood we need to be as we're getting ready for entering the promised land. That would be my kind of the trajectory that Moses here is putting emphasis on this patriarchal narrative. So that's the theological lesson. All right, well, we leave chapter 37 for a little interlude, chapter 38. We'll probably be able to get to this before we have our first break today. So really, Genesis 38 is kind of a story within a story. It's kind of a pericope or a kind of a periscoping into the day and life of Judah, one of the sons, one of these 10. It's a window into single brother Judah. So let's look at chapter 38, starting in verses 1 through 3. And let's see here. How about Sherry? Why don't you read for us, chapter 38, verses 1 through 3.
It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name
Okay, you can just pause there. It's interesting, some similar language that we see if we see he saw and took, the idea that we see some parallel language that that goes back to Genesis 6, where the sons of God saw and took, which goes all the way back to Genesis 3 and the sin of the garden. So the seeing, recognizing it's good, and the taking idea is an interesting echo that we have here. Judah's carrying the seed of the promised he of Genesis 3:15. But now he's going out to, find a wife amongst the Canaanites. Judah's firstborn son, takes a wife, and we see that, Tamar is going to be the wife of Okay, so now what happens here? Let's see. Let's just keep reading here. So she conceives. Okay, Judah. There we go. So she conceives, that is Judah's wife, and conceives and has a son named Then she conceives again, and she bears a son named Onan. She bore another son named Shelah, and Judah took a wife for So now he's finding wives for his sons. The first wife's Tamar. She's the leading first lady of the story here. But Judah's firstborn son, was evil or bad in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord took his life. Now, what happens here, this creates a problem for the household of And we look at passages like Deuteronomy chapter 25. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 25, looking at verse 5. And within household structures, we talked about the household structure before. To preserve a household, you always need a son to carry the name of the family, as well as carrying that seed to produce sons and to keep the household alive. And what happens if you have the tragedy of losing the only son or the only seed-bearing individual within a household, in this case a fledgling household? Verse 5 in Deuteronomy 25, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, which is in the case of now Tamar, the wife of the deceased shall not marry outside of the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife to perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted from Israel. This is a way of preserving the household with regards, and this is Tamar's situation. So this adds to perhaps the conflict that we see in the rest of this story. What happens with the brothers? What do the brothers do in this situation? So let's keep reading there. Sherry, keep reading there in verse 8.
Where were we?
In chapter 38.
Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her mother's house.
All right, let's just pause there. So there's this failure, and here demonstration of disloyalty to the household with regards to the what we see with what the role would be of the brothers in this case, not performing their role, and the tragedy that ensues. But behind all of this, we have the scene of, I would use the word injustice against Tamar. She's being ignored and forgotten as a rightful female participant in this household. The antithesis of this, you probably know, the story's coming up even in this semester for us when we look at the story of Ruth. So Ruth is the antithesis. So what I mean there is, while Tamar is the forgotten female, in a similar situation, we have Ruth, who will be eventually showing up, who's the remembered one, who's the one who's cared for with regards to her situation under the provisional system or the legal system within Israel. A properly functioning community is going to provide for these kinds of things, because the household structure in the ancient world was the mechanism for the economy and for the preservation and provision for protection for the large group, the households together, which make up a small city and eventually a nation or a group of people. So this is disloyalty. Judah's demonstrating disloyalty to Tamar, who's the outsider. Boaz, in contrast, will demonstrate loyalty to Ruth, who's also the outsider. And we'll get to that at the end of the semester. So we see a little bit of a break here, going down to verse 12. So you see in verse 12, after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. So a considerable amount of time passes. Judah's Canaanite wife dies, and after a time of mourning, he leaves Tamar behind to join up with a bunch of his friends. We see the fact of Tamar being ignored again only escalated as she takes the bull by the horns, you might say desperate measures, in verse 14. So let's see. Christopher, you're over here. Could you read for us in verse 12? Verse 14, I'm sorry.
So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given him as a wife.
Okay, let's just pause there. So now what we've got going on, here's Tamar, she's desperate in her context, in her cultural context. She's got no one from Judah's household to carry out the household, to carry out the preservation of the household name through a son. If Judah will not provide for her what she's so desperate for, as one who should be recognized by this household, then to take the bull by the horns in Tamar's case, maybe she will be provided for as one who is unrecognized. Kind of play off the recognized, unrecognized. So now we have the aftermath of this in verse 16. She's wrapping herself and sitting in the gateway of Enaim. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a harlot or a prostitute, in verse 15, for she had covered her face. So she turns aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, he recognizes her for who she's not. He says, or Judah says, now let me come into you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she says, what will you give me that you may come into me? So here she is now following through with being unrecognized, asking for the payment price for being a prostitute. So it's interesting. She's not a fool. She's requesting a pledge. What we see here in down in verse 17, he says, "I'll send you a kid from the flock," aka payment. She says, moreover, "Will you give a pledge until you send it?" So the pledge is, a kind of something that recognizes or symbolizes the promise of payment in verse 17. And he says, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she says, "Well, I see some things. How about your seal and your cord and your staff that's in your hand?" So he gives them to her. He consummates the relationship with the prostitute, and then she conceives by him. So she arose and she departs, and she removes her veil and puts on her widow's garments. All right, so this is a kind of a tightly written narrative here. But we see here as in verse 22, down here in verse 22, well, I'll just keep reading here. Judah's going to send the payment or the pledge by his friend. She asked the men of her place, saying in verse 21, or he asked this guy, "Where's the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There's been no temple prostitute here." So he returns to Judah and says, "I did not find her. Furthermore, the men of the place said there has been no temple prostitute here." It's interesting that Judah recognizes her as a prostitute, but then nobody else really does. That's interesting. That might be something significant. While she's desperate for being recognized as a member of this household. So the extreme intentions of Judah. What happens in verse 24? After a time of 3 months later, Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry." Well, she's recognized as a prostitute. And that's interesting because she's recognized, by the community, she's recognized for someone who she was not. So what happens here, and this is where the pledge comes into play, right? Judah's going to have some extreme comments there at the end of verse 24. "Bring her out and let her be burned," which seems a bit extreme. So it's while she's being brought out that she sends for her father-in-law, saying, "I'm with child by this man whom these things belong." And says, "Please examine and see whose signet ring, cords, and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She's more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again." So we see the birth of Perez, and that's going to play a significant role in terms of the genealogy that we see with Boaz and Ruth, and eventually will lead to the birth of the king, King David. So this is genealogically important with regards to how does God work through here. It seems as if people who are on the sidelines, but outside of the community of faith, there are times when the Lord works through the faithfulness and fidelity, it seems, of the what we would say is the unsuspecting individuals. We wouldn't expect this. But here, to preserve the household name and thus the seed, we have to get to Perez, which will get us to David and eventually to the Messiah. Here's what it looks like in terms of this chart here, and other significant women who are outsiders: Shua, Tamar, Rahab, and soon we'll see Ruth. 4 non-Israelite women who all contribute to the male godly line seed that eventually leads up to King David and then eventually to the Messiah. So they do kind of fit in significantly to the history of where we go and where we follow the seed line that gets us down to Yeshua, or the Messiah. All right. Now we're back to the Joseph narrative, but I want to take a 10-minute break before we come back and pick up with chapter 39. And I promise you we'll finish Genesis before we're done tonight.